School bully attacks a black girl, never expecting who would protect her. Amara's day had started like any other. She woke up early, tied her hair neatly into braids, and carefully packed her books into her worn but clean backpack. Her mother always reminded her, "Education is your shield, Amara. It will carry you further than anything else." Those words stayed in her heart every morning as she walked to school. At only 14, Amara was already wise beyond her years. She loved reading more than anything else. While other children laughed loudly on the playground, she often chose a quiet corner of the library, where she could lose herself in stories about faraway lands, brave heroines, and people who overcame great struggles. Books were her friends, and the library was her safe place. That morning, as she walked through the school gates, she clutched her books tightly to her chest. She had a math test later that day, and she wanted to review a few notes before class began. The sky was bright, the air smelled of freshly cut grass, and for a moment, everything seemed calm. But Amara knew that peace never lasted long in her school hallways. There was someone who made sure of that: Chad. Chad was taller than most kids in their grade, with a loud voice and a habit of making himself the center of attention. He liked to joke, but his jokes were never funny for the people on the receiving end. He picked target students who were quiet, shy, or different. Unfortunately, Amara was one of his favorites. It wasn't because she had done anything to him. In fact, Amara avoided him as much as she could. But sometimes, bullies choose their victims not because of what they do, but because of who they are. Amara's quiet confidence, her love for learning, and the way she stood apart without trying to impress Chad in the wrong way. He saw her as someone he could tease, someone who wouldn't fight back. That day, Amara walked into the main hallway, her books balanced carefully in her arms. She planned to head straight to her locker and then to the library before class. But halfway through, she heard the sharp laugh that always made her stomach tighten. "Well, if it isn't the little bookworm," Chad's voice rang out. Amara froze. She knew it was coming. Slowly, she turned her head. There he was, leaning casually against the lockers with two of his friends. His smile wasn't warm, it was the kind of smile that meant trouble. She lowered her eyes and kept walking. Maybe if she didn't respond, he would let her pass. She told herself, just keep moving. Don't stop. But Chad had no intention of letting her go. He pushed himself off the locker and stepped directly in front of her, blocking her way. "Where are you rushing off to?" "Got another boring book to read," he said, his voice mocking. Amara's heart pounded in her chest. She swallowed hard and kept her voice steady. "I need to get to class, Chad. Please move." Her calmness only seemed to amuse him more. He looked at her books, then suddenly reached out and tapped the top one with his finger. "What's this?" "Math. You think you're smarter than everyone else, don't you?" he sneered. Amara shook her head. "No, I just like to study." His friends laughed at her simple answer. The sound echoed down the hallway, drawing more students to stop and watch. Amara felt her cheeks burn, not from shame but from the unwanted attention. She hated being the center of a crowd. Chad's grin grew wider. Without warning, he knocked the stack of books out of her arms. They fell to the ground, pages scattering across the shiny floor. Gasps rippled through the students standing nearby. Some bent down as if they wanted to help, but then hesitated, too afraid to cross Chad. Amara bent quickly to gather her books. Her fingers trembled as she picked them up, one by one. She could hear Chad chuckling above her, proud of what he had done. "Look at her," he said loudly so everyone could hear. "Always crawling around, picking up scraps. That's where she belongs." The words cut deep, but Amara bit her lip and said nothing. She had learned that answering back only made things worse. She tried to breathe steadily, telling herself to stay calm. Still, The humiliation stung. Why did he always do this? Why couldn't she just walk in peace like everyone else? As she reached for the last book, Chad's foot slid forward, pinning it to the ground. Amara froze. She looked up slowly, meeting his eyes for the first time. He stared down at her with a challenge in his gaze, daring her to react. For a moment, Amara considered standing up and pulling the book away. But she saw the crowd, the eager faces waiting for drama, and she knew Chad would only push harder. Her hands tightened into fists, but she kept them by her side. The hallway seemed unbearably quiet, except for the faint hum of laughter from Chad's friends. Amara's heart pounded so loudly she could hear it in her ears. She whispered, "Please move your foot." Chad leaned closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "Make me." The words carried a weight of cruelty, but also insecurity. Still, Amara felt small, trapped, and powerless. Then, just as the silence grew heavier, another voice cut through the hallway, strong, clear, and commanding. "Enough." The single word hung in the air, and every head turned. Amara's eyes widened as she saw who had spoken. Standing a few feet away was Marcus, the captain of the school's football team. His tall frame and confident posture made the crowd part instinctively. He wasn't just popular, he was respected, someone everyone looked up to. Marcus's gaze locked on Chad, his expression serious. "Leave her alone," he said firmly. The hallway erupted in whispers. Students exchanged glances, stunned that Marcus had stepped in. Chad blinked, momentarily caught off guard. He hadn't expected anyone, especially Marcus, to interfere. Amara's breath caught in her throat. For the first time that day, she felt a glimmer of relief. Someone had noticed. Someone cared enough to stop it. Chad straightened, trying to recover his pride. "I was just having some fun," he muttered, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. Marcus didn't move closer, but his presence was enough. "That's not fun," he said. "Pick up her book." The command was simple, but powerful. The crowd held its breath, waiting. For a long moment, Chad hesitated. His jaw tightened, his pride wrestling with the reality of the situation. Finally, with a muttered curse under his breath, he nudged the book toward Amara with his foot and stepped back. Amara picked it up quickly, clutching it to her chest. She didn't say a word, but her eyes flickered toward Marcus, silently thanking him. The bell rang, breaking the tension. Students hurried to their classes, whispering about what they had just witnessed. Amara gathered her things and walked carefully down the hall. Her steps were steady, but inside her mind was racing. She had been humiliated again, but this time something different had happened. Someone had stood up for her. And she knew deep down, this was only the beginning of a story that would change everything. The echo of the morning incident lingered in Amara's mind for the rest of the day. Even while she sat in her math class, her pencil poised above her notebook, she couldn't stop hearing the sound of Marcus's firm voice in the hallway. Enough. That word had carried such weight that it silenced the laughter, the taunts, and even Chad's arrogant smirk. For the first time, Amara felt something unusual. Someone had stepped into her world to shield her. She had grown so used to fighting battles quietly, keeping her head down, and hoping the storms would pass, that the sudden intervention left her almost stunned. Marcus had always seemed far away from her life. He was the star athlete, a leader on the football team, and admired by students and teachers alike. People crowded around him in the cafeteria, cheered for him at games, and respected him in classrooms. Amara, on the other hand, lived in the quiet shadows of the library, unnoticed and often invisible. Yet, in that single moment, their worlds had crossed. At lunch, the whispers spread across the cafeteria like wildfire. Students who had been in the hallway earlier replayed the scene with exaggerations, adding color to every detail. Some claimed Chad had looked terrified. Others swore Amara had stood up boldly before Marcus stepped in. Stories grew larger as they passed from table to table, until almost everyone knew what had happened. Amara sat in the corner of the cafeteria with her small sandwich, listening quietly. She didn't want attention. Her heart beat faster whenever she heard her name mentioned, even if it was whispered. She lowered her gaze, trying to block out the noise, but it was impossible to ignore the curious glances aimed at her. Chad, however, was not enjoying the sudden popularity of the story. He sat at a different table, his face tense and his jaw clenched. His friends tried to joke about it, but he wasn't laughing. Being embarrassed in front of half the school was not something he would forget easily. His pride was wounded, and though he stayed quiet, the fire in his eyes promised he wasn't done yet. Meanwhile, Marcus ate at his usual table with teammates. He seemed calm, as though the incident had barely shaken him. But inside, Marcus was thinking carefully. He had stepped in instinctively, unable to stay silent as Chad humiliated Amara. Something about her silence and the way she bent to pick up her books had struck a deep chord within him. It reminded him of his younger sister, who had once gone through a similar experience in another school before their family moved to this town. He had promised himself back then that he would never allow cruelty to happen in front of him without stepping in. When lunch ended, Amara headed toward the library again. She wanted to escape the chatter and lose herself in the comfort of books. The tall shelves and quiet atmosphere always gave her a sense of safety. As she tucked herself into her favorite corner, she finally exhaled, feeling a little more at peace. But moments later, a shadow fell across her table. She looked up nervously, expecting more trouble. Instead, she saw Marcus standing there, holding his tray. "Mind if I sit here?" he asked politely. Amara blinked in surprise. Of all the places he could sit, why here? She nodded quickly, her words caught in her throat. Marcus set his tray down and took a seat across from her. For a while, he didn't speak. He simply opened a notebook and scribbled a few things, giving Amara space. Finally, he looked up and smiled gently. "You okay?" he asked. Amara hesitated. No one ever asked her that. Not really. She nodded again, then whispered, "Thank you, for earlier." Marcus shrugged modestly. "You don't have to thank me. What he did wasn't right. Anyone should have said something." Amara lowered her gaze. "But no one ever does." Her words hung in the air, soft but heavy. Marcus leaned back, studying her expression. She looked tired, as though carrying a burden too big for her small frame. "That doesn't mean no one ever will," Marcus said firmly. "Sometimes people are scared to step up. But fear doesn't make wrong things right. You deserve respect just like anyone else." Amara looked at him, her eyes shining faintly with something between disbelief and gratitude. She wasn't used to hearing such words, not from someone like him. The conversation was short, but it left Amara with a warmth she hadn't felt in a long time. For the rest of the day, she walked a little taller, though still cautious, knowing Chad's silence was not the end. The next morning, tension was already in the air. As Amara entered the school, she noticed students whispering again. Chad leaned against the lockers with narrowed eyes, but he didn't approach her immediately. Instead, he watched, waiting. His pride demanded a comeback, but he wasn't reckless. He knew Marcus was watching too. By third period, the uneasiness grew. Amara tried to focus on her lessons, but every time the classroom door opened, her heart jumped. She could feel the storm building, though she didn't know when or how it would break. Finally, it came during gym class. The girls and boys were separated into groups, but they all shared the same gymnasium. Amara was running laps quietly when she saw Chad on the other side with his friends. His eyes locked onto her, and a smirk spread across his face. As she slowed to tie her shoe near the bleachers, Chad strolled over. "Well, look who we have here," he said casually, his voice low so the coach wouldn't hear. "You think Marcus will always be around to save you?" Amara's throat tightened. She didn't respond. Chad leaned closer. "You're lucky, you know. But luck doesn't last forever." Before he could say more, Marcus jogged across the gym to where they stood. His expression was calm but sharp. "Is there a problem?" he asked. Chad straightened, his bravado slipping again. "Nah, just talking," he muttered. Marcus's gaze didn't waver. "Good. Keep it that way." The tension between the two boys was thick, almost electric. Students nearby noticed and began whispering again. The coach, sensing something was off, blew his whistle and barked at everyone to keep moving. Amara tied her shoe quickly and returned to running, her heart racing. She hated being the center of this silent battle, but at the same time, she felt an odd comfort. Marcus wasn't just defending her, he was setting a standard. He was showing everyone that silence in the face of cruelty was no longer acceptable. Later that afternoon, as the final bell rang, Amara gathered her belongings and prepared to leave. As she stepped outside the school building, she saw Marcus waiting by the gate. "You don't have to walk alone," he said simply. Amara blinked, surprised. "Why?" Marcus gave a small smile. "Because sometimes standing alone is the hardest part. Everyone deserves someone by their side." The walk home was quiet, but comforting. For the first time in a long while, Amara felt the heavy weight on her shoulders lifting, even if just a little. She realized that kindness, when shown at the right moment, could change everything. But she also knew Chad wasn't finished. He had too much pride, too much anger at being embarrassed. And while Marcus's presence gave her safety, the storm was far from over. In the days that followed, the whispers grew louder. Students were no longer just talking about Chad's bullying, they were debating sides. Some admired Marcus for stepping in, while others thought Chad would eventually win back control. The school felt divided, and Amara, unwillingly, was in the middle of it all. What had started as another ordinary morning had now become something much larger. Amara's quiet life was shifting, and she couldn't shake the feeling that bigger moments, both terrifying and powerful, were waiting just ahead. The week that followed the confrontation was unlike anything Amara had ever experienced at school. What had once been just another hallway incident had now grown into something far larger, almost like a silent war dividing the students. Everywhere she went, she could feel the shift in the air. Whispers trailed her steps, and curious glances followed her into classrooms. Amara was no longer invisible. The girl who once melted into the background of the library was now at the center of attention, whether she wanted it or not. The story of Marcus standing up to Chad had spread far beyond the hallway. By now, everyone in the school had their own version of it. Some students admired Marcus openly, saying he had shown real courage. Others, especially those who liked Chad's boldness, grumbled that Marcus was trying to act like a hero. Amara hated being caught in the middle. She had never wanted to be noticed. She had only wanted peace, the freedom to walk through the hallways without fear. But now, even her silence became part of the debate. One afternoon in the cafeteria, she overheard two girls whispering at the table behind her. "Did you see her face when Marcus stepped in? She looked so weak, like she couldn't even handle it herself." "That's not fair," the other girl replied. "Chad's twice her size. What was she supposed to do? At least Marcus helped." Amara gripped her sandwich tighter, her appetite gone. She didn't want to be spoken about like she was fragile, but she also knew they weren't entirely wrong. She hadn't fought back. She had stayed quiet, as always. Meanwhile, Chad's anger simmered. His pride had taken a heavy blow in front of everyone, and he wasn't the type to forgive or forget. He walked through the school with an edge in his stride, his eyes scanning the hallways as though daring anyone to challenge him. His friends tried to hype him up, reminding him of all the times he had been the toughest kid around. But deep down, Chad knew Marcus's presence had shifted things. He couldn't just shove Amara again without risking another confrontation, and he wasn't ready to face Marcus head-on. Still, the idea of being outshone burned inside him. One day after class, Chad leaned against the lockers, his arms crossed, watching Marcus as he walked by. "You think you're the hero now?" Chad called out, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Marcus paused, turning to face him calmly. "No, I just think people should be treated with respect." Chad scoffed, his laughter hollow. "Respect? You think you can change this place with one speech? You don't know how things work." Marcus met his gaze without flinching. "Maybe it's time they work differently." The students nearby froze, watching the exchange. Some nodded quietly at Marcus's words, while others smirked, waiting for a fight. But Marcus didn't take the bait. He simply walked away, leaving Chad standing there, his jaw clenched and his pride aching. Amara heard about the moment later from classmates. She wasn't there to see it, but the whispers told her everything. Marcus was holding his ground, but Chad's anger was building. She felt a knot tighten in her stomach. That evening, Amara sat on her bed, her books spread out but untouched. She stared at the pages, unable to concentrate. Her mother knocked softly on the door before stepping in. "You're quiet tonight," her mother said gently. "Is something wrong?" Amara hesitated. She rarely shared school troubles at home. She didn't want to worry her mother, who already worked long hours to keep their household steady. But this time, the weight was too heavy to keep inside. "Mom, why do some people hate others for no reason?" Amara asked in a soft voice. Her mother's eyes softened as she sat beside her. "It isn't about you, Amara. Sometimes, people hurt others because of their own insecurities. They feel small inside, so they try to make others feel smaller." Amara nodded slowly, her chest heavy. "But it doesn't stop. No matter what I do, it never stops." Her mother reached out, smoothing a braid away from her face. "You don't have to fight every battle alone. Sometimes, the right people show up when you least expect it. And sometimes, their courage helps you find your own." Amara thought of Marcus. His voice, his steady gaze, the way he stood tall against Chad without shouting or fighting, it all echoed in her mind. The next day at school, the division became even clearer. Students whispered in corners, some wearing admiration on their faces whenever Marcus passed, others glaring at him as though he had broken some unspoken rule. By lunchtime, the cafeteria felt like a battlefield of stairs. Marcus sat with his teammates, calm as always, while Chad sat with his own crowd, whispering angrily and sending sharp glances across the room. Amara sat quietly at her usual spot, her tray untouched. She could feel the eyes on her too, some filled with sympathy, some with curiosity, and others with judgment. She wanted to disappear, but she couldn't. Not anymore. Later that week, the principal finally called Chad, Marcus, and Amara into the office. The tension in the small room was thick, each student sitting stiffly in their chairs. The principal, a serious woman with sharp glasses, looked at them firmly. "I've heard enough reports about tension in this school. This needs to stop. Chad, you've been accused of bullying. Amara, you've been the target. Marcus, you've stepped in more than once. I want the truth, now." Chad crossed his arms, scowling. "I didn't do anything serious. Just joking around. People are making it bigger than it is." Amara felt her heart race. She hated speaking up in front of authority, but she knew this was her chance. Taking a deep breath, she spoke quietly but clearly. "It wasn't a joke. He's done it many times. I just never said anything before." The room fell silent. Amara's voice, though soft, carried a weight of truth that couldn't be ignored. Marcus gave her a small, encouraging nod. The principal sighed, scribbling notes. Bullying is not tolerated here. Chad, this is your warning. If there's another incident, there will be serious consequences. Chad's face darkened. He hated being called out, but he didn't argue. When they left the office, Amara felt a strange mix of fear and relief. She had finally spoken up, even if her voice trembled. Marcus walked beside her, giving her a reassuring smile. "You did great," he said. Amara shook her head. "I was scared." "Being scared and still speaking up, that's real courage," Marcus replied. For the first time, Amara felt a spark of strength flicker inside her. She realized she wasn't as powerless as she thought. But she also knew this wasn't the end. Chad's silence as he left the office told her everything. His pride was still burning, and he wasn't finished. The stage was set. The school was divided. And Amara, once invisible, was now standing at the center of a storm she never asked for. The days after the meeting in the principal's office felt different for Amara. For the first time in a long while, she felt like she had taken a small step toward defending herself. Her voice, quiet and trembling though it was, had been heard. She hadn't thought she could speak up, but she had. And that moment stayed with her like a small flame glowing in her chest. But the tension at school didn't disappear. If anything, it grew heavier. Chad walked the hallways like a storm cloud ready to break. His silence was more unsettling than his taunts had ever been. Students whispered behind their hands, wondering what he would do next. Amara tried to stay focused on her studies. She sat in the library whenever she could, her books spread across the table as she buried herself in math problems or stories that carried her far from the school walls. But no matter how deep she read, she could still feel the weight of the stares, the whispers, and the unspoken questions. One afternoon, as Amara packed up her things to leave the library, Marcus walked in. His tall frame and calm presence filled the room. He waved lightly, then walked over to her table. "You hiding in here again?" he asked with a small smile. Amara gave a faint laugh. "It's not hiding. It's just quieter here." "I get that," Marcus said, pulling out a chair and sitting across from her. "But you don't always have to be alone, you know." Amara hesitated, glancing down at her books. "I'm used to being alone." Marcus leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. His voice softened. "Can I tell you something?" She looked up, curious. "When I was younger," Marcus began, "my little sister went through the same thing you're going through now. She was bullied at her old school. She was shy, loved reading, kind of like you. And kids picked on her just because they thought she was different." Amara's eyes widened. She hadn't known this about him. Marcus continued, his gaze steady. "One day, I saw her crying after school. She tried so hard to be strong, but I could see how much it hurt her. I promised myself I'd never stay quiet if I saw it happening again to anyone. That's why I stepped in with Chad. Not because I wanted attention, but because I couldn't just walk away." Amara felt her throat tighten. She had always wondered why Marcus had chosen to defend her when so many others stayed silent. Hearing his story made her see him differently, not just as the popular athlete everyone admired, but as someone who understood pain in his own way. "Your sister, is she okay now?" Amara asked softly. Marcus smiled. "Yeah. She's stronger than ever. She learned how to stand up for herself, and now she helps others do the same. I think you can do that too, Amara. You don't see it yet, but you've got a lot more strength than you realize." The words touched her deeply. She had always felt small, like her voice didn't matter. But hearing Marcus's faith in her stirred something inside. Maybe she wasn't as powerless as she believed. That evening, as Amara walked home, she thought about his words again and again. They gave her courage she hadn't felt before. The next morning at school, that courage was tested. During history class, the teacher asked for volunteers to present their group projects. Amara's group had worked hard, but when it came time to speak, her classmates looked at her expectantly. Normally, she would shrink back, letting others take the spotlight. But today, something inside her shifted. "I'll do it," she said, her voice steady. Her group members looked surprised, but they nodded. Amara stood at the front of the class, her hands trembling slightly as she held her notes. She took a deep breath and began. At first, her voice was soft, but as she continued, she grew stronger. She explained the project clearly, answering questions with calm confidence. For the first time, she felt like she wasn't just existing in the background, she was being heard. When she finished, the class was silent for a moment, then the teacher smiled warmly. "Well done, Amara." A ripple of applause followed, small but genuine. Amara felt her cheeks flush, but this time, it wasn't from shame. It was from pride. Chad, sitting at the back of the room, watched with narrowed eyes. He didn't clap. His jaw tightened as he realized Amara was no longer the quiet girl he could easily push around. She was finding her voice, and that unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. After class, several students came up to her, offering kind words. "You did great, Amara," one said. Another added, "I didn't know you could speak like that. You should do it more often." Amara smiled shyly, grateful for their encouragement. For once, the attention didn't feel heavy, it felt freeing. Later that week, the school organized a special assembly about respect and kindness. The principal, aware of the growing tension, wanted to address the issue of bullying directly. The entire school gathered in the auditorium. The principal spoke firmly about the importance of treating everyone with dignity, reminding students that silence in the face of cruelty was as harmful as the cruelty itself. Then, to Amara's shock, the principal called her name. "Amara, would you like to share something with your classmates?" Her heart nearly stopped. All eyes turned to her. She froze, unsure if she could handle standing before hundreds of students. But then she saw Marcus in the crowd, giving her a steady nod of encouragement. Amara rose slowly, her legs trembling, and walked to the front. She stood at the microphone, her palms sweating. For a moment, she wanted to run. But then she remembered her mother's words, Marcus's faith, and her own small flame of courage. She spoke softly at first. "I've been quiet for a long time. Too quiet. I thought if I stayed silent, the bullying would stop. But it didn't. It only made it worse." The auditorium was hushed. Amara continued, her voice growing stronger. "I want everyone here to know, words hurt. Actions hurt. And when no one stands up, it hurts even more. But when someone does, it changes everything. I know, because Marcus stood up for me. And it gave me the strength to stand here today." The room remained silent for a heartbeat, and then applause erupted. Loud, genuine applause that filled the space. Students clapped, teachers nodded, and for the first time, Amara felt truly seen, not as a victim, but as someone brave. Marcus smiled proudly from his seat, his heart swelling with respect for her. She had done what even he hadn't expected. She had stepped forward on her own. But not everyone was pleased. Chad sat stiffly in his chair, his fists clenched. His pride had been bruised again, not just by Marcus, but now by Amara herself. The more the crowd applauded, the more his anger burned. As the assembly ended and students filed out, Marcus walked up to Amara. "You were amazing," he said sincerely. Amara shook her head, her eyes shining. "I was terrified." He chuckled softly. "That's what makes it even braver." For the first time, Amara believed it. She wasn't just the quiet girl anymore. She was someone who had faced her fear and spoken up. And though the road ahead was still uncertain, she knew one thing clearly: she would never go back to silence again. But deep inside, she also knew Chad wouldn't let it end there. His silence was dangerous. His pride was wounded, and a storm was still brewing. Sparkle's word count, 1320 words the week after the assembly, was unlike any other. Something had shifted in the air at school. Amara, who had once been nearly invisible, was now seen in a new light. Students greeted her in the hallways with small smiles, some even stopping to say, "Great job at the assembly," or, "I liked what you said." It felt strange, almost unreal. For so long she had walked these hallways with her head down, trying to avoid attention. Now people looked at her differently, not with pity, but with respect. And for the first time in her life at school, Amara walked with her head a little higher. Marcus noticed the change too. He would nod at her whenever they passed, sometimes stopping to chat for a minute about homework or practice. His encouragement had been a light in her darkest moments, and she was grateful for it. But she also knew something important: she had begun to find her own strength. Chad, however, struggled to accept what had happened. Each time he saw Amara, something twisted inside him. It wasn't just anger anymore. It was confusion. He couldn't understand how the girl he once mocked without consequence had suddenly found courage. He couldn't understand why Marcus's words carried so much weight, or why people were siding with them instead of him. His friends noticed too. "Man, just let it go," one of them said one afternoon. "It's over. Everyone's moved on." But Chad shook his head. "It's not over. Not for me." His pride still burned, and he couldn't let it go. A few days later, the storm finally came. It happened after school, near the backfield where students often gathered before heading home. Amara walked quietly, her backpack heavy with books. The autumn air was crisp, and the sky was painted in soft shades of orange and pink. She thought about going straight home, but a part of her felt calm enough to take the longer route, enjoying the cool breeze. She didn't see Chad and his friends waiting until it was too late. "Hey, bookworm," Chad's voice called out. Amara froze. She turned slowly, her heart pounding. Chad stepped forward, his friends hanging back but watching closely. "You think you're tough now, don't you? Standing in front of the whole school, talking big." His words were sharp, but there was something unsettled in his tone. Amara swallowed hard. She wanted to run, but she stood still. "I only spoke the truth," she said softly. Chad's jaw tightened. "Truth? You made me look weak. You think Marcus is gonna be around forever to protect you?" Amara's voice trembled, but she forced herself to meet his eyes. "I don't need anyone to protect me anymore." The words surprised even her. They came out steadier than she expected, carrying the strength she had been slowly discovering inside herself. Before Chad could respond, another voice broke in. "She doesn't need me," Marcus said, stepping out from behind the bleachers. "But I'll still be here." Chad spun around, his face darkening. "You again." Marcus walked forward calmly, his expression firm but not angry. "This has to stop, Chad. You're not proving anything by doing this. You're only hurting yourself." The tension in the air was thick. Chad's friends shifted uncomfortably, unsure if they should stay or leave. Amara's heart raced, but she felt something different this time. She wasn't just standing in fear, she was standing with a quiet kind of courage. "Why do you even care?" Chad demanded, his voice rising. "Why do you keep stepping in?" Marcus paused, his voice steady. "Because I know what it feels like to be powerless. And I know what it feels like to be judged for something you can't change. No one deserves that, not Amara, not anyone." You're better than this, Chad. You just don't see it yet. The words hit harder than Chad expected. For a moment, his mask of anger slipped, and something else flickered in his eyes: confusion, doubt, maybe even shame. Amara saw it too. And for the first time, she realized something important: Chad's cruelty wasn't strength. It was weakness. It came from a place of insecurity, a place he didn't know how to escape. You don't have to be this way, Amara said quietly, her voice surprising even herself. You don't have to tear people down to feel strong. The silence that followed was heavy. Chad looked at her, then at Marcus, and then at the ground. His fists unclenched slowly. His friends shifted again, clearly waiting for his response. Finally, Chad muttered, "Whatever," and turned away. His pride wouldn't let him admit defeat out loud, but his steps were slower, heavier, as though carrying the weight of his choices. His friends followed, whispering among themselves, leaving Amara and Marcus standing in the fading light. Amara let out a shaky breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Marcus gave her a small smile. "You did it?" She blinked. "Did what?" "You stood up. You faced him without hiding." "That wasn't me, that was you." Amara felt a warmth spread through her chest. For so long, she had believed she was powerless, invisible. But in that moment, she realized she had grown. She had found her voice, her courage, and her strength. The next day at school, the atmosphere was different again. Chad didn't bother her. He didn't bother anyone. The whispers about him faded, replaced by quiet respect for Amara. Students looked at her differently now, not as a victim, but as someone who had faced her fears and come out stronger. Even the teachers noticed. Her history teacher asked her to help lead a class discussion. Her librarian gave her a knowing smile and said, "I always knew you had something special inside you." Amara's mother noticed too. One evening, as they sat together at dinner, she looked at her daughter with pride. "You've changed," she said softly. "You carry yourself differently now. Stronger." Amara smiled shyly. "Maybe I just finally believe what you always told me, that education and courage are my shield." Her mother reached across the table, squeezing her hand. "And now you're using both." The story of what happened didn't disappear overnight, but it left behind something powerful. The school began to change, slowly but surely. Teachers worked harder to create a safe environment. Students who once stayed silent started speaking up when they saw unfairness. And in the middle of it all, Amara discovered that her voice mattered. As for Chad, he grew quieter. He didn't transform instantly, but he stopped targeting others. Perhaps Marcus's words had sunk deeper than he wanted to admit. Perhaps seeing Amara's courage had shaken something inside him. Change takes time, but a seed had been planted. On the last day of the term, Amara walked through the same hallway where it had all begun, the place where Chad had once knocked her books to the floor. But this time, she wasn't alone. Students nodded at her as she passed, her books safe in her arms, her steps steady. Marcus caught up to her at the door. "Big plans for the break?" he asked casually. Amara smiled. "Lots of reading. And maybe, writing my own story this time." Marcus grinned. "I'd like to read that." As she stepped out into the bright sunlight, Amara felt lighter than she had in months. She had faced cruelty, found courage, and discovered something important: that strength isn't about size or power. It's about standing tall, even when your voice trembles. And in that simple truth, Amara had not only changed herself. She had changed the people around her too.